Joining us from Washington, D.C., former foreign policy advisor for Bernie Sanders, Matt Duss, visiting scholar at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace from Lauderdale, Florida, executive director of CaseBack, Bryan Leib, former executive director of the Iranian Americans for Liberty, and international affairs analyst Dan Perry, former chairman of the Foreign Press Association here in Jerusalem. Thank you, gentlemen, so very much for joining us as our main topic today. Like any couple attending those last-ditch mediation efforts, not of personal experience of speaking here, heard from a friend. Let's put it that way. Comes a point where you need to ask, shared past? Absolutely yes. Shared present? Inevitably so. But what about a shared future? So before we begin our conversation, let's take a listen to some of the remarks of Israeli President Isaac Herzog short moments ago at the Oval.
It's a heated debate, but it's also a virtue and a tribute to the greatness of Israeli democracy. And let me reiterate clear, crystal clear, Israeli democracy is sound, strong, is resilient. We are going through pains, we are going through heated debates, we are going through challenging moments, but I truly believe, and I would say to you, Mr. President, as I've said it as head of state to the people of Israel, we should always seek to find amicable consensus. And I agree with you on that as well. I'm pursuing it even in these very moments through my people as much as we can in order to find solutions and exit out of this crisis.
Yeah, so Herzog is saying democracy shall prevail in Israel. But are the U.S. and Israel getting a divorce? We start, as always, with a quick fire round, 30 seconds each to lay out your initial stance on the matter, gentlemen, and we'll pick up the conversation from there. So, Matt Duss, please take the lead. Your 30 seconds are on.
Sure, thank you. I wouldn't say that the U.S. and Israel are heading for a divorce. I think the relationship is longstanding. It's deeply rooted and institutionalized. I would say it's probably going to change, especially if Israel continues down the current path of moving in a much more right-wing direction, a more illiberal direction, and a more undemocratic direction. I think you see voices within the Democratic Party and the broader progressive movement that are raising much more vocal criticisms about Israeli policies toward the Palestinians and the occupied territories and what Israel's ultimate plans are for those territories, since the current government seems to have pulled back from the two-state solution quite remarkably.
Yeah. Bryan Leib, your thoughts?
Well, first of all, I think there's nothing wrong with vocal criticism of the state of Israel, but when you're calling Israel a racist state, that's more than just vocal criticism. Listen, I think the U.S. and Israel alliance is a long-standing alliance. I think Israel is one of America's best friends, not just in the Middle East, but throughout the world. And there certainly are voices in the Democratic Party that are trying to drive a major wedge between that alliance and into the Jewish community. But I think overwhelmingly the American people and our representatives in Congress do support a strong U.S.-Israel alliance.
Last but not least, Dan Perry, your take.
I don't know about a divorce, but I think infidelity is certainly possible. I mean, Israel needs the U.S.
Sometimes it's a better solution, right?
And Israel has wanted more than a marriage. Israel wants a special relationship, and it has had one. And that relationship is based on more than just interests. The idea of shared values. Now, the current government of Israel does not share values with the Biden administration, Democratic Party, most Americans, and I think most American Jews. So if that's the direction Israel takes, a liberal direction, then the relationship will suffer.
Okay, gentlemen, and from this point onwards, let's feel free to interact, of course, and let me just remind you and our viewers that we're, of course, waiting for Israeli President Isaac Herzog to wrap up the meeting with President Biden, and we will be taking his remarks live as they happen. But until then, is Israel becoming more of a strategic, is turning rather from a strategic asset to an American burden, Matt?
I don't know if I'd call it a burden. I think there have always been both costs and benefits to the United States, strategically, politically, for the U.S.-Israel relationship. But again, I think it's and one of the my colleagues before made a remark about efforts to divide the U.S. from Israel. I would say there is no single person in the world who has done more to undermine bipartisan support for Israel in the United States than Benjamin Netanyahu. He, from taking his very strong position against President Obama's policies, seeking to undermine him at every turn, accepting an invitation to speak to a Republican-led Congress to attack one of President Obama's major foreign policy initiatives, the Iran nuclear agreement. So I think Netanyahu himself deserves an enormous share of the blame for this. But at the same time, I think we also see a Democratic Party that has much stronger constituencies among Palestinian rights advocates, among Black African American voices who are not necessarily hostile to Israel. I think that's the wrong way to characterize it, but they too take very, very seriously the actions that they see in the occupied territories day after day.
Bryan, I can see that you're not in full agreement.
Well, I don't understand this rhetoric, right? I mean, you're dropping J Street talking points about, Netanyahu is the biggest obstacle for peace and the biggest reason that there's this wedge happening. I mean, Netanyahu was not the one calling America a racist state or a racist country. That is what members of your party are doing, sir. They are driving a wedge into the U.S.-Israel alliance and into the Jewish community, and they're trying to, as we've heard from Ilhan Omar in the past, accuse us Jews in America of having dual loyalties. That's not coming from Republicans. That's not coming from Benjamin Netanyahu. That is coming from people within your party that are stoking this divide. So I'm sorry, I firmly disagree with what you're saying.
My party, that the overwhelming majority of American Jews agree with the Democratic Party. The majority of American Jews agree with J Street's position since you brought that up.
The
and they vote for the
majority of people do not agree with J Street's position. That is a pipe dream. That's a pipe dream.
I don't think you can ignore the fact that 70 to 80% of American Jews in every election for the past 40 years have voted for the Democrats.
70%.
And it's no surprise. I mean, Israel has indeed projected that it shares fundamental American liberal values aligned with those of most American Jews. But in Israel, that is making permanent the occupation of the West Bank and not giving the Palestinians the right to vote in the West Bank, which is certainly not part of this government's plan, is misaligned with the values that Americans hold dear. It's no surprise that therefore they drift apart, and one cannot blame the Democratic Party, despite, the fact that in the far left fringe of the Democratic Party may make statements that probably we'd all be uncomfortable with.
And yet,
I think that's right. And one thing
please, Matt.
The thing I would add here is that, yes, I think, it's quite right to call out inappropriate criticism when it does occur, but I think the vast overreaction to Congressman Jayapal's comments, and I would direct viewers to the excellent piece from New York Times columnist Michelle Goldberg, which I thought treated this issue very, very fairly. So much of this, including some of what we've heard, I think, here today, is an effort to distract from the real issue, which is policies toward the Palestinians in the occupied territories. That, more than anything, it is what is starting to create a different kind of debate and causing people to rethink the sort of relationship that the United States should have with Israel.
It's actually three things. Certainly, it's the Palestinians. It is also the fact that an Israel led by the Right Religious Alliance is headed in an increasingly not just authoritarian, but also theocratic direction. It's not yet a theocracy, but that is the dynamic. And the third thing is the matter of the relationship with American Jews, whose support for Israel, I do believe, has been something that has underpinned the relationship overall of the U.S. and Israel. I mean, 80% of American Jews are liberal by any measure I've ever seen. Most of them are reform. The orthodoxy in Israel that is allied with the right wing in Israel projects disdain towards the American Reform Jews, and that's not something that's going to create good karma and cement a special relationship.
Yeah, I think that's right. And one thing, my last point here is that I think a lot of Americans, including myself, who identify as progressives and Democrats, have been absolutely inspired by the protests that we've been seeing in Israel since January against the efforts of the current government to change the judiciary. I think there's a lot to be learned in that. I think we are seeing a really enormous and impressive effort to do politics in the streets, and that does matter.
And I would add, it's not just changing the judiciary.
Can we agree, gentlemen?
If I may just complete the thought.
Please go ahead.
the full raft of reforms that were proposed from the beginning included not just government control over the appointment of justices and judges who would be puppets, but when the puppets forget to act as puppets, it would enable the parliament by a simple majority to overrule their decisions. That is genuine elected autocracy. Okay, and I don't think that's anything that the American body politic can get behind. I mean, even the evangelicals don't want this. Okay, ask yourself, what would prevent Caligula from appointing his horse to the Senate?
Dan, I do have to stop you right here because Israeli President Isaac Herzog is speaking. Brian, we'll get back to you once the president is wrapping up his statements. Let's chime in.
I'm home.
I am home. That was the feeling the president gave me. That he loves Israel, that he pursues peace, and that he supports Israel's security. You can feel that the unbreakable bond between all those presidents who sat at this house throughout the years and all those members of Congress, the connection between those and the people of Israel is a family connection. I told that not a long while ago to someone who I've been speaking with about this topic. It is not just any ally America has. There are family elements here. So this is why the concern is sincere about what is happening domestically in Israel. So our conversation revolved around regional matters with Iran, with Lebanon, the Middle East, but also about what's happening inside Israel. And we need to understand and respect that when the president of the biggest superpower in the world is interested in what's happening in Israel, it is not for nothing. It is not in order to poke anyone. It is because of a sincere, deep concern of our need in Israel as a nation to reach understandings at this moment of the crisis, to reach some sort of a formula out of it. Israel is important to the world, Israel is important to the region, and Israel is important and dear to the U.S. And this also should be another consideration for our brothers and sisters back in Israel.
Dear friends, I had a wonderful meeting with President Biden. President Biden is a huge friend of the State of Israel. I am reminded of how he landed with Air Force One in Israel a year ago in July. As he was walking down Air Force One, he was waving to me and saying, "I'm home, I'm back home." And indeed, President Biden reiterated his ironclad commitment and his utter friendship and love of the State of Israel and his support for the State of Israel. And we discussed, thus, many issues, including the Iranian nuclear threat and the operations by Hezbollah to flare up the region, as well as our ironclad alliance on security, including the ability to build regional cooperation and move forward on the circle of peace. And naturally, we've also discussed the internal issues in Israel, how important they are to the world, of course, where they stem from. But I reiterated my commitment, as I said before. Israeli democracy is strong and resilient, and we should definitely see the current debate in Israel with all its facets as a tribute to the strength of Israeli democracy. Thank you very much.
All right, gentlemen, that was Israeli President Isaac Herzog just out of the Oval, wrapping up his meeting with the U.S. President Joe Biden. We all heard what he had to say. So, you know what, maybe we will allow you all to give your insights on the statements. What do you make of it? Brian, we stopped you right before Herzog took the podium.
Well, I think Herzog definitely struck all the right notes and said all the right things in his meeting with President Biden. With that said, I do think it should be Benjamin Netanyahu that is making this visit. I do understand that Netanyahu and Biden have finally had a conversation, and we'll see if and when that progresses. But the one thing that sticks out to me that Herzog said is they talked about the Iranian threat. And the one thing that I really just can't seem to understand is that the Biden administration will find the time to call the Netanyahu government extreme, but they will not say anything as Iran has executed now over 300 of their own citizens in the first 6 months of this year, while they continue funding terrorist proxies both in and outside of Israel. So if the Biden administration is serious about supporting Israel, I think the biggest thing that they could do for once and for all would be to walk away from any diplomacy with the world's leading sponsor of terrorism. And it would be nice if Herzog and other people in Israel would start pressing the United States to make actual move on that front.
Yeah, Dan, what's your impression, and also perhaps the difference between the Washington care of Tehran and Jerusalem in this respect?
Well, on one level, you always have, there is a double standard, of course. The world does not expect good behavior from Tehran. The world does not reward Tehran for good behavior the way it has rewarded Israel, who is a close ally of the U.S., a massive trading partner of the EU, invited to the Eurovision Song Festival, and so forth and so on. So realistically, it's just not the same. I certainly agree that Iran is worthy of criticism more so than the Netanyahu government. I do not agree that the U.S. should have ever walked away from the nuclear deal. And you know who shares that point of view? Most of the Israeli security establishment, because Iran was far away from a nuclear bomb that threatens my children 4 years ago, and today it's very, very close to one. So I think you need to be practical as well as anything else. As for Herzog, he said all the right things, but I think, all know very well that Herzog is mortified, no less than Biden, by Netanyahu's effort to take Israel in a direction of authoritarianism.
Okay, and on that note, let's head to the streets of Tel Aviv. Whatever's happening in Tel Aviv, having a direct impact on what's happening in Washington and vice versa. I-24 News correspondent Hamda Salhut right outside the American Embassy in Tel Aviv. Hamda, what's going on there?
Ellie, good evening. Demonstrations happening here earlier. They have since left, and they have traveled to the main rallies at Kaplan and other streets in Tel Aviv. What these organizers and protesters are saying is that Israel and the United States share a lot of common values, especially when it comes to democratic norms. And if the legislative overhaul were to go through, then all of those values would be compromised. So demonstrators are calling directly on the United States to get involved in this legislative overhaul process, because they're fearing that democracy as a whole will cease to exist, but also that the values that Israel and America share that bring them close together, because they are such close allies, will all be thrown out the window if these bills go through, Ellie.
Yeah, Hamda Salhut, thank you very much for this. Gentlemen, another quick fire round, and we take it from there. Do the judicial reforms really matter to the U.S.? Is it really about that? Matt, take the lead, please.
Yeah, I think they do. I mean, President Biden has repeatedly criticized or cautioned against moving quickly on this, because I think his administration has many times prioritized the struggle to defend democracy against authoritarianism, against right-wing populism that we see around the world, including in the United States. And this effort by the current Israeli government is simply another example of that. So I do. If we have an interest as Americans in supporting democracy here and around the world, as I certainly believe we do, then pausing these efforts in Israel are really important.
Dan, your thoughts?
Look, I have to agree that there is inconsistency here, because the U.S. Certainly has alliances, and even the Biden administration will continue alliances with countries that are not democratic, certainly less democratic than Israel would be, even should the authoritarian overhaul take place. That said, yes, I do think they care, because they care about Israel. Biden calls himself a Zionist. He cares if Israel becomes an authoritarian democracy like Hungary, Poland, Turkey, or what Russia was a few years ago before becoming a full dictatorship. I guess the answer is yes.
Brian, your take.
First of all, I think Joe Biden knows whatever he's told to read on his note cards, as we just saw evidenced in his most recent conversation with Herzog. But I think at the end of the day, the American people are a little bit more concerned with really what's happening within our own borders here. And I would caution you gentlemen and also anyone else to truly respect the will of the Israeli people, which is being reflected in the Israeli government right now. And at the end of the day, this government's going to execute on a mandate that was given to them by the Israeli people.
May I quibble with that? Because really, you hear this so often, it has to be corrected. There is no mandate. Likud had no platform in the last election. The last election was a tie. The majority in parliament is a legal distortion based on splits in what is now the opposition. And moreover, Netanyahu never once spoke of these things, and every single poll, bar none, shows that 60 to 70% of the public opposes these reforms. When we speak of a mandate, I literally have no clue what you're talking about.
And yet, fast forwarding to now, it is the policy Jerusalem is pursuing. Is Washington right to get into Israel's domestic affairs, Matt?
I wouldn't say the president and any American politician certainly has the right to express an opinion. I would not say they are interfering, certainly not to the extent that we've seen interference from, for example, Netanyahu in coming to Congress to speak against President Obama's Iran policy. But certainly, the United States has been a longtime supporter and partner of Israel. We give Israel close to $4 billion a year in military aid. So I think the United States, for all of those reasons, is certainly entitled to express opinions about the direction of the Israeli politics.
Moreover, I think the Israeli public is entitled to know what are going to be the consequences of the actions of its government. This is a little bit of a delicate thing because the opposition in Israel stands accused, and I think in some ways rightly so, of inviting foreign pressure on a government, and that can look a little bit uncool. But you can look at it a different way altogether, which is it might be a favor to the Israeli public if the American government or any outside government actually made clear what would be the consequences of the actions the Israeli government intends to take. Because, Israel has the right to do what it wishes, but other countries have the right to not be so friendly with a government that acts in that way. And I think the Israeli people occasionally might have some confusion on the score, and Biden's non-invitation to date of Netanyahu to the White House, I think, is aimed on some level at settling that confusion.
So to that point of the Israeli public, we're so well versed throughout the years to hear it, this threat that Israel is becoming a partisan issue in the U.S. But perhaps now, on the flip side, from the Israeli standpoint, is the U.S. becoming a partisan issue in Israel, Bryan?
Perhaps it is. I mean, I can't speak for the Israeli people, but I would think that the Israeli people would like for President Biden and members of Congress to stop dropping figurative bombs on the Israeli people and on the Israeli government on what feels like a weekly basis. I mean, I can only imagine if I'm President Herzog on a plane coming to the United States of America and there's members of Congress that are calling his country a racist country. I can only imagine how that feels, and I think that's probably reflected in the feelings of a lot of Israeli people as well.
I think they're calling the government racist. I mean, not that I would support that necessarily, but that's what they're calling racist.
Her words were Israel is a racist state. She didn't use the words.
And Congressman.
But that wasn't Biden. That was a congresswoman.
Clarified those remarks.
Oh, yeah, right. She misspoke, right? It was just a little dust up that she called Israel a racist.
Well, but it wasn't the administration.
Viewers should go and read her. Viewers can go and read her clarification and make their own minds up.
Yeah, okay.
The U.S. is a partisan issue in Israel in the following way. Many people in the current government are not at all stupid, and they do know the consequences, and they don't care. The direction they want to take Israel in is a desire that they are so vehement about that they understand the consequences and will accept them. And that is not the entirety of the roughly half of Israel that voted for this government, but it's some of them. And in that sense, when I say America can say what it wants, we don't care, they're being very honest and transparent.
Matt.
I would also just add, rather than obsessing, although language is important, and again, I think it's important and was welcome that Congresswoman Jayapal clarified her remarks. But I do think that obsessing over the choice of words is a distraction from the actual point here, which is policies toward the Palestinians. I mean, this is what she was referring to. This was the protest that got her attention at the conference she was attending. And I think there is an effort to kind of obscure that reality. But that effort is failing because Americans can see that day after day after day. So I think addressing that would behoove everyone, Americans and Israelis, and certainly Palestinians who endure this day after day.
But I think Jews are it's understandable if Jews are especially sensitive to being called racist. And that is, frankly, an unfair accusation. Okay, you have black Israeli soldiers policing cities with white Palestinian occupied people, and I fail to see where racism has anything to do with it. There's a national conflict, and there's certainly an ethnic conflict writ large, but I think racism is definitely unfair. So it was correct to call
that's a fair point. If one wants to say an ethno-nationalist or an ethnic supremacist state, that might be a better choice of words, but I take your point.
I think given the history of the Jews, it's fair enough to quibble.
Gentlemen, if we want to talk about rights for the Palestinian people, who is that partner for peace for the Israeli government? Who are they supposed to bridge this gap with right now?
Right. No, I mean, you get this question a lot, but again, I think this is another distraction. Whether or not the Palestinians. The point is, regardless, and I'm not here to defend Mahmoud Abbas or the Palestinian Authority, although that's what you would like me to try and do. But I think regardless of who the Palestinian Authority is, that Israel is choosing to pursue policies that make a two-state solution impossible. This is the goal of the current government.
And even if there's no partner for peace on terms that Israel finds acceptable, that doesn't justify the colonization that creates a one-state reality where a quarter to a third of the effective population of that one state does not have the right to vote.
Brian, final remarks before we wrap it up.
I mean, listen, my comments when it comes to Israel building new communities on Israeli land has always been pretty consistent. I think they're well within their sovereign rights to do so.
It's not Israeli land.
Excuse me?
Annexed. It's not Israeli land. They never annexed it, and understandably not.
We will have to save this one for a different time.
Friends like you for Israel, you wonder why they're under the microscope the way they are.
You think it is Israeli land? Remarkable.
Well, okay. Well, glass half full. We thought there's a new crisis. It appears to be the same old debate that is putting a spoke in the diplomatic wheels here. Gentlemen, Bryan Leib, Dan Perry, Matt Duss, thank you very much. Hey, I see you liked it. Want more? Just hit the subscribe button right here. Go on. I know you want to.